The original Mega Man debuted on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987 and would get 5 sequels on the same system that maintained a consistent level of quality. After Mega Man 6 concluded the 8-bit run, the series made the jump to 16-bit Super Nintendo with Mega Man 7, where it more or less maintained the format that came before while introducing some new things. The end result didn't please everyone, but it was still a competent and well-made Mega Man adventure that stayed the course and is still fun to play. Before Mega Man 7 debuted on the system, the SNES already had its version of Mega Man in the form of Mega Man X, which took what the classic series built and expanded on it while taking advantage of the more advanced hardware. 2 sequels would follow on the system, and as before, there was a consistent level of quality in regards to gameplay. Then the series made the jump to 32-bit with Mega Man X4 debuting on the Sony PlayStation, and also the Saturn, but nobody cared about that one. And it was a promising entry that gave hope for this new era before the quality took a nosedive with X5 and X6 due to a desire to be different, which presumably meant being less good. When it came time to bring Mega Man X over to the PlayStation 2 for the 7th entry, Capcom decided to change the game once again, and rather than stick with the tried and true formula or whatever was going on with the previous 2 entries, they were going to take the series into the 3rd dimension, territory traversed by the RPG-oriented Mega Man Legends series. However, they didn't want to commit to this bold new direction fully for whatever reason, and so the end result became this sort of half-and-half game, where you had the somewhat traditional side-scrolling platforming bits, then the game would shift to this 3D perspective with an unreliable camera setup, and vice versa. And I will give Capcom credit. They tried something different for X7, and after a dozen or so Mega Man games following a similar formula, one could argue the series could have used some freshening up. And they failed miserably, resulting in what could arguably be the worst entry in the Mega Man X series. X5 might have been depressing to play, and X6 was rather frustrating for all sorts of reasons, quite frankly. But Mega Man X7 was an utterly miserable experience from start to finish, with nigh a bright spot to be had anywhere. Right off the bat, Mega Man X7 hits you with controversy as the title character and star of 6 previous entries in this series is no longer playable from the get-go. That's right, kids. The guy named Mega Man X is not playable in a game called Mega Man X until much later. Poor guy says he's fed up with all the fighting, and that's actually consistent with his character. He's usually opposed to violence, but I'd imagine that's a cover-up. The real reason being he's sick of being the star of some questionable video games, saw the writing on the wall with this one, and said, you know what, nah, I'm good. Zero, you handle this Mavericks thing since you're still not dead for some reason, and take the new kid with you, I'm out. And so the 7th episode of Mega Man X begins with the intro level, as these games usually do, with players in control of a new character called Axel, a former member of the Red Alert group that's gone bad and we're supposed to care about, even though we've never heard of him before up to this point, and I don't know, I guess if it worked for Repliforce and X4. Anyway, Axel plays somewhat like X does, except he has no charge shot, but he does have a copy shot, which is a secondary fire button thing where you kill an enemy with it, it leaves behind a soul that you could pick up, and you could transform into that enemy for a period of time, assume their abilities and what have you. It's not quite as useful as they intended. There's probably only a couple of times where I actually used it or needed it, and the rest of the time, it's just a complete afterthought. He also has a limited hover ability that's a little more useful, but not by much. Also available as a partner is our old buddy, our old pal Zero, who was depicted as being written off in X6 so he could spam some GBA games, but I guess he's still around much to the chagrin of the Inif King, but okay, whatever. Unfortunately, Zero is not quite as effective a fighter as he was in the traditional format. His attacks are kinda awkward and cumbersome, and the 3D portions don't help him much in this regard, despite possessing an air dash, double jump, and the ability to deflect projectiles with his lightsaber as default skills. You wonder why he's even a part of this from a narrative perspective, but the execution makes me wonder if maybe they were better off slotting X in this role instead. Speaking of X, he does become playable after clearing away the Mavericks or rescuing some 60 plus Reploids, of which there are 16 per stage and can be killed by just about anything. More on this later. Anyway, X plays as he always has. He runs, he jumps, he shoots, can charge his shot to fire more powerful shots, and he could dash both on the ground and in the air. Yes, it took 7 games, but Vanilla X finally has an air dash as a default skill. Could have used that in the previous game, but whatever, better late than never. As before, X can look for light capsules to assemble pieces of his newest armor, the Glide Armor, and much like the early games, whenever X acquires a part, he'll immediately benefit from its enhancement. Now, the armor itself is really nothing special, especially compared to what came before. You'll get a new glide move that keeps you airborne a little while longer, basically an extended version of Axel's hover. You'll absorb energy capsules from a distance, be able to charge special weapons, gain a less than stellar Giga Crush move. I guess it's like Mighty No. 9, it's better than nothing. I suppose. I don't know. New to the series, unless you've played Mega Man Extreme 2 on Game Boy Color, is the team-up mechanic, where you press the L2 trigger to swap between both your players. It's a nice little feature that allows you to swap between characters in a bind, but it's not perfect. Characters in reserve do not regenerate health, and if you die, you lose a life and restart at the beginning of the last segment or checkpoint or whatever. Which is funny because Extreme 2 did it the same way, and I didn't give it much thought there because that game didn't suck. Okay, let's backtrack a bit. When it comes to the progression, it's familiar fare. You play an intro level that overstates its welcome as it attempts to ease you into this new playstyle and fails. Then you tackle 8 Maverick bosses in any order, gain their powers or in Zero's case new techniques and even new weapons, all the while collecting upgrades and rescuing Reploids, and once you clear all 8 stages, it's off to the final stretch of levels where you fight off the Red Alert forces and eventually tackle Sigma once more, because it's not really a spoiler at this point. So yes, X7 retains the Reploid saving fetch quest of the previous 2 games, where you'll occasionally come across stranded Reploids that you'll have to rescue before they are killed off by enemy forces. It's even more of a pain in the ass now because anything can kill a Reploid, and some of them are positioned in places that makes it extremely difficult to reach them in time. And sometimes collision detection in saving these assholes is spotty, so thanks for that. Rescuing Reploids are somewhat essential. Some have 1-ups, life and weapon energy extensions, and upgrade parts that you assign to your team after gameplay. Basically, you pick a character and a stat you want to upgrade with said part, and it's done. Once you've made your choice, you cannot undo it, so choose wisely. Admittedly, X7's part system is something of a step up because specific parts are no longer tied to specific Reploids, even though specific Reploids still yield certain benefits. But that's a good thing though. And in a game with very few bright spots, I'll take what I can get. Because they're your starting characters, Axel and Zero will be benefiting the most from these parts, since they'll be doing all the rescuing until you eventually unlock X, which is accomplished by, again, killing all the Mavericks or rescuing about 60-ish Reploids. This will leave X at a disadvantage because by the time he's unlocked, he'll be outclassed by the other 2 hunters and their multitude of upgrades. Fortunately, there are a total of 128 Reploids to rescue, with 16 per stage, with 2 of them per stage possessing parts. As long as they're not killed off, of course. So you could easily get X to do some heavy lifting afterwards and build them up. So, shouldn't be much of a problem then, if you know your management and whatever. I don't know. As stated, X7 adopts a hybrid style where you will alternate between pseudo 2D side-scrolling bits with some dynamic camera shots for good measure, and almost full-blown 3D segments more akin to a third-person shooter of sorts. It's trying something new while also keeping a foot in familiar territory. It's also not executed very well in either case. A lot of this has to do with camera angles and your inability to control the camera, most of the time at least, so you'd have better visibility. While the 3D segments suffer from this the most, the 2D segments aren't any better. Either the camera's too zoomed in or it's shot from an awkward angle to make the scene appear more dynamic or exciting or... Nah, no buzz, doesn't work for me, sorry. But even with a working camera, which probably would have helped up a bit, Mega Man X7's gameplay is largely bad and boring. The 2D segments come out best because they're somewhat straightforward and only vaguely play like the old games, but the level design in these segments are largely very basic. Radio Tower is basically walking along in a straight line for the majority of it, with some minor platforming tossed in for good measure. Aside from poor zooming and angles, these parts are not terrible. They just make you wish you were playing a better video game. But then you get the 3D segments, and well, a lot of these levels are fairly similar. Wide open spaces with lots of stuff going on, while your hero moves about very slowly. Seriously, it is amazing how slow you move here, which is a contrast to the 2D segments, as well as the rest of the series for that matter. And the wide open spaces are such that you could easily, pretty much, circumvent any enemy encounters by walking past them, which is usually a wiser course of action. Some levels take place in tight corridors, which is always fun times with a shitty camera you can't control. And then there's this opening Air Force bit where you're hopping planes. That's fun, I guess, especially when you die and you have to see the opening intro again. And there's a ride chaser segment where you have 2 minutes to collect bombs before they blow up, all the while rescuing Reploids from certain doom. Now, I will go out on a limb and say that I've hated these ride chaser segments in these Mega Man X games, particularly the PlayStation ones, and I'm happy to report that this 3D take on the concept have soured my mood even further, so thank you for that. X7 adds a limited auto-aiming feature, which usually targets the closest hostile in the general facing direction, though you can choose specific targets if desired. Auto-aiming is a tremendous addition to the game and makes it a hell of a lot more tolerable, even if it does have a tendency to be a bit fickle at times, especially when there's a lot of targets in the area. Does it remove the additional need to aim your shots for that extra bit of challenge people strive for in these types of games? Perhaps, but the way I see it, the less time spent trying to land my shots on a very tiny target is less time spent playing this absolutely miserable video game. So I'll take what I can get to make life easier and be done with this quicker. And that's the other key thing that hurts X7. It runs like molasses, not just in terms of slow-moving heroes or any bits of slowdown that might pop up when a lot of shit is going on, but the pacing in general seems designed to waste your time. You occasionally have these little cinematics play out during gameplay, which is fine. What is not fine is that dying at some point and having to watch these cinematics over and over and over again. That Air Force level I mentioned, yeah, fall off a plane and you're treated to this opening segment over and over and over again, and you can't skip them. You can't skip the boss dialogues or anything like that. None of that. It's very irritating. I want to say the game at least controls well enough. For the most part, they are responsive, though not always. For some reason, dashing will fail to execute at inopportune times, which is baffling. Sometimes jumping won't work for some reason. Are you for fucking real? I pressed the fucking button. What the Sometimes you'll start charging shots and then you won't fire because it's cancelled by turning or something. During this auto-scrolling level where you're being chased by this tank thing, which is fun enough on its own, but if you're playing Axel, his hover ability will not work for some reason, but air dashing and X's glide move will, and... Actually, you know what? I take it back. The controls are fucking awful. With L2 and R2 reserved for tagging and target aiming respectively, weapon cycling is mapped to the right analog stick, and it works as it did before. No instant shortcuts to specific weapons like in Mega Man 11, and I'm oddly fine with that actually. Aelia returns to dispense information at certain points, usually prompting you to press select or listen to her intel. Text scrolling also takes forever during these parts, and it's also something you cannot speed up. I've tried, it doesn't work. Why does this game insist on wasting my time and... I don't know if you could tell, but I really dislike playing Mega Man X7. This is a genuinely terrible video game. There might be some other points of interest I'm missing, but honestly, I don't care. I just want this shit to be done with. Even this video is running too long for my tastes, for fuck's sake. Let's Let's just get this over with. Mega Man X7 sports 3D polygonal graphics in lieu of the sprites that normally grace the series, so that means all new visual assets to work with, and it looks fine-ish, I guess. The environmental set pieces look fairly decent, on par with typical PS2 standards of the time. The character models look somewhat awkward at times due to this sort of cel-shaded look that they have going on. It doesn't quite work all that well, and the movement is also kind of weird looking. Some things that look fine in pixels and motion simply don't translate to polygons. And of course, the atrocious camera angles that this game likes to inflict on you, often obscuring parts of the playfield, or simply zoomed up so close you could make out the hero's nostril hairs more so than the rest of the playfield, which is more vital to your doing anything worthwhile. For the most part, these are fixed angles and you can't change them, which makes them as much of an obstacle to overcome as any gimmick obstacle in the game. There are rare instances where you're given limited control over the camera, which you use with the L1 and R1 triggers, but these come along so infrequently that it's easily forgotten about. But hey, it's not all bad though, right? Those in-game cutscenes where the characters talk with their lips closed? Cutting-edge technology right there. And yeah, okay, so everybody shits on the voice acting. Yeah, I get it. It's bad. It's not great. X sounds whiny. Axel sounds like a punchable kid. Zero sounds like he doesn't give a shit, considering he's died a billion times and they just keep bringing him back because they simply can't think of anything better. Can't say I blame them. The rest of the cast is kind of a mixed bag, but piss poor direction I feel is a culprit here. So yeah, fine, whatever, we've got that out of the way. Moving right along. Did you really think I was just gonna let that slide by? The one thing that actually pretty much sums up Mega Man X7 in a nutshell. Anyways, now we can move on. Voice acting aside, audio is another weak point in X7. Sound effects are some of the usual recycled stock stuff with some new sound effects, and they sound slightly cleaner on PS2 hardware. The little voice blurbs come off as repetitive after a while, regardless of the vocal quality, and the soundtrack is just blander than bland. I want to say there's at least a couple tunes that are pretty decent, but honestly I'm drawing a blank here. After a while, it all starts to sound the same. Generically generic pseudo-rock tunes, no notably memorable melodies. Well, you know what? I'll take that back. There's the Radio Tower one that kind of sticks out and is not even one of the better tunes. The Deep Forest was okay-ish, I guess. Meh. There is no need for an overly long exposition of concluding thoughts with this one. Mega Man X7 is the absolute low point of the Mega Man X saga, the worst game in this particular era of Mega Man, and it simply boils down to poor execution of a new idea. The 3D aspect of the game simply doesn't work in any way, shape, or form, and the 2D segments are a far cry from the days when the style was at its best, or at least when it was at its minimally playable. Just about the only idea that seems to work well here is the team-up mechanic, which would live to see another game in an improved format. I will say this much. It took balls on Capcom's part to take a series from its familiar trappings and attempt something genuinely new with it, and while the final product didn't deliver, I can at least appreciate the effort. Appreciation, however, does not equate enjoyment, and Mega Man X7 is a decidedly unenjoyable experience. Recommended for the Mega Man completionist because they gotta play every Mega Man thing out there, but everybody else can just skip this one and not miss a beat.